Welcome to Moonlight Mysteries, a calm space for long, research-rich mysteries. If you enjoy these sleepy deep dives, please like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss new episodes. If you'd like to support the channel, a quick comment with your favorite moment helps more people find us. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's begin. The Circleville Letter Writer. Introduction. Circleville, Ohio in the 1970s was a place that seemed peacefully ordinary, tucked into flat farm fields and winding country roads. This small Midwestern town moved at a gentle pace. Located about 30 miles south of Columbus, and away from any interstate highways, Circleville had around 12,000 residents in the late 1970s. The local economy depended on farming, a few small factories, and mom-and-pop businesses. By reputation, it was a town where everyone greeted each other by name and believed nothing truly wild or criminal could ever happen there. The town was proudly known for its annual pumpkin show. Each October, the town's streets transformed for that festival, a century-old tradition of pumpkins, parades, and country pride. Most days, Circleville's quiet streets and wholesome atmosphere made people say to themselves, "Nothing crazy ever happens here." But in the 1970s, something very crazy did happen. Over the course of several years, the residents of Circleville were terrorized by a mysterious letter writer. This unknown author seemed to know everything about everyone and wasn't shy about sharing it. The letters accused neighbors of worse sins, embezzlement, domestic violence, affairs, even murder, all in lurid detail. They arrived in mailboxes without return addresses, each letter a ticking bomb of gossip and threats. What had been a trusting little community suddenly felt under siege. Just a walk to the mailbox could trigger terror, especially for one woman in particular, a local school bus driver named Mary Gillispie. Chapter 1. A Community Shaken. At the time the letters began, Circleville was the sort of tight-knit community where news traveled fast, but serious trouble was rare. It was a good place to live, fairly peaceful till all this stuff started, as one longtime resident would later recall with a nervous laugh. In those early days of the letter saga, the town's natural inclination towards neighborly concerns turned into a climate of suspicion. This was a community where people looked out for one another. Now, they peered out their windows and wondered which friend might secretly be an enemy. The arrival of the anonymous letters changed everything. One day, Mary Gillispie found a strange envelope in her mailbox with a Columbus postmark and no signature. Soon, other Circleville businesses and families received similar letters. They accused recipients of scandalous behaviors. An affair here, an abuse there, airing secrets no one expected to see written down and mailed. The letters were written in a distinctive style, blocky hand-printed capital letters, often laced with profanity and venom. They read like the work of someone with a personal vendetta and a moralizing streak eager to shame and expose. For a while, many townfolk tried to dismiss it as a prank or an isolated crank, but as the letters multiplied, it became clear that this was a calculated campaign. The poison pen writer was relentless, and the letters were deeply personal. They named names, cited specific details, and showed knowledge of intimate facts about people's lives. Whoever was behind them had to be someone local, someone blending into the community by day and wielding a pen as a weapon by night. In a town like Circleville, serious crime was scarce. Sheriff Dwight Radcliffe, an experienced lawman who had served for years, mainly dealt with minor disturbances or the occasional petty theft. A shadowy threat by mail was unlike anything the community or its police had ever faced. The local authorities were caught off guard. Sheriff Radcliffe was a veteran in law enforcement, but his experience mostly involved routine small-town issues. A malicious letter writer pulling the strings of fear was a phenomenon beyond his prior cases. How do you stop a crime when the perpetrator is a faceless phantom? As residents traded rumors and worries, the mailbox, that everyday symbol of friendly correspondence and catalogs, became a source of dread. Neighbors watched each other with new wariness. Was the letter writer among them at the grocery store or the football game? The sense of betrayal cut deep into Circleville's natural trust. Yet, amidst the fear, life had to go on. Children still went to school each morning, and shopkeepers still opened their stores. The difference was that now, every time someone opened their mailbox, their hearts raced a little. The once quiet town felt as if it had an invisible enemy lurking in its midst. Chapter 2. Mary and Ron Gillispie. At the center of this unfolding drama was Mary Gillispie. Mary was a school bus driver in her mid-30s, a lifelong Circleville resident who was known and liked by many of the town's families. She was married to her high school sweetheart, Ronald or Ron Gillispie, and together they had 2 children. By all accounts, Mary was a devoted mother and a friendly, reliable presence on her daily bus route. In an old Jackson Middle School yearbook photo, Mary appears smiling and confident, a young woman voted Miss Jackson back in her school days. She married Ron soon after graduation. He was a solid, hard-working man, described by those who knew him as kind-hearted and dependable. Ron provided for his family, and the Gillespies lived in a modest home on a quiet street, embodying the all-American small-town family. Mary's routine was simple. Each weekday, she drove bus routes in the Westfall School District, ferrying kids to and from school on the rural roads around Circleville. One of her supervisors in that job was Gordon Massey, the superintendent of schools. Massey was a well-thought-of man in Circleville, a married father himself, and in a position of authority. Mary's interaction with him were professional, but the anonymous letter writer would soon claim there was more. In the spring of 1977, Mary received the first strange letter. It accused her of having an affair with Gordon Massey, The letter's tone was furious and commanding, warning Mary to end the alleged relationship at once. Mary was shocked. She knew she was not romantically involved with Massey and couldn't fathom why someone would say this. The writer asserted they had been watching her, even mentioning details like, "I know you have children, and I've been observing your house." Mary initially kept the letter to herself, perhaps hoping it was a one-time fluke or a cruel joke. Within a week, another letter arrived with similar message, urging her to confess and stop running around with the superintendent or face exposure. Mary's sense of alarm grew. Not only was someone stalking her movements, but they also threatened to broadcast these accusations to others. Indeed, soon enough, letters about the supposed affair were sent to Ron Gillispie, Mary's husband, and even to Gordon Massey himself, and members of the school board. The writer was on a rampage to make this alleged secret public knowledge. Ron received a letter telling him that if he didn't put a stop to Mary's affair, his life was in danger. He later got another that explicitly suggested violence. "You should catch them together and kill them both." The shock and rage these letters must have stirred in Ron is hard to overstate. Ron confronted Mary, but she vehemently denied any infidelity. By all indications, Ron believed his wife. The letters, after all, were all anonymous and cowardly. Perhaps some jealous troublemaker was targeting them. The Gillespies realized they needed to confide in someone they trusted and figure out who was doing this. They turned to Ron's sister, Karen Sue Freshour, and her husband, Paul Freshour. Karen was Mary's sister-in-law, and Paul was thus Mary's brother-in-law by marriage. The Freshours were close family. Mary and Ron felt they could rely on their discretion and support. In a private discussion among the four of them, they shared the contents of the letters and their fears. Mary mentioned she had an idea who might be behind them. David Longberry, a fellow school bus driver who worked with her. David Longberry had once made a pass at Mary. She had rebuffed his advances, and although nothing came of it at the time, the incident stuck in her mind when these accusatory letters began. Could it be David nursing a grudge or jealousy, trying to cause trouble? The letters' focus on her romantic life made Mary think of someone who might have been personally hurt by her. David fit that profile. With this suspicion in hand, the group decided on a bold strategy. They would send an anonymous letter to the suspected letter writer to scare him off. Paul Freshour took the lead in drafting these letters, 4 or 5 of them in total. The notes essentially told the suspect, "We know who you are, stop what you're doing, or you will be exposed." They did not threaten harm, just exposure and consequences. After mailing these to the person they believed was the culprit, they waited. For a short while, it seemed to work. The threatening letters to Mary and Ron stopped coming. The Gillespies breathed a tentative sigh of relief and hoped the nightmare was over. They handled it privately without involving law enforcement, thinking a direct confrontation by letter had solved the problem. Unfortunately, this respite was only temporary, a calm before an even darker storm. Chapter 3: A Mysterious Death. On a warm evening in August 1977, everything changed. The letter writer, whether it was Longberry or someone else entirely, decided to take things to the next level, and the Gillispie family would be struck by tragedy. On the night of August 19th, 1977, Ron Gillispie was at home with his children. Mary was away on a trip to Florida with some friends, a vacation she had undertaken to distance herself from the stress in Circleville. As the story goes, around 10:30 p.m., the phone rang at the Gillespies. Ron answered. On the line was a voice he seemed to recognize, at least enough to know who was speaking. The caller said something that enraged Ron. Perhaps they claimed to be watching the house, or taunted him about Mary and Massey. According to later statements from Ron and Mary's children, Ron hung up the phone, went to retrieve his handgun, and told the kids he was going out to confront the person responsible for the letters. He was described as appearing very upset but determined. Ron left in his pickup truck, a red and white Ford, speeding off into the darkness. He did not specify whom he was going to meet, but the implication was clear. He believed the mystery tormentor had just called and essentially challenged him. At that moment, Ron likely thought he was finally going to face the letter writer and end this once and for all. About 10 minutes later, Ron's truck was found wrecked at an intersection not far from his house, a place he knew like the back of his hand. The truck had run off the road at high speed and struck a tree. When passerby and police arrived, they found Ron Gillispie slumped behind the wheel, dead from the impact. The scene was gruesome and perplexing. The truck's engine was still sputtering, headlights cutting into the quiet country night. There were no skid marks to indicate braking or swerving. It was as if Ron had suddenly lost control or consciousness. The sheriff's office, led by Dwight Radcliffe, investigated the crash. Under Ron's body, they discovered his handgun. It had one round fired. This raised immediate questions. At what point and at whom had Ron discharged his weapon? No one at the scene reported hearing a gunshot, though in the countryside at night, a shot might go unheard by neighbors. Did Ron encounter the letter writer on the road and fire at them? Did someone fire at Ron, causing him to fire back and then crash? Or did Ron, in a state of anger and possible inebriation, fire a wild shot into the air in frustration as he drove? An autopsy revealed that Ron's blood alcohol level was 0.16, about 1.5 times the legal limit for driving in Ohio. This was a shock to those who knew him, as Ron was not known to be a heavy drinker. His family swore he rarely, if ever, drank to excess. Could the coroner's test have been wrong? Or had Ron, in his distress that evening, downed some alcohol after that phone call to steel his nerves? The high BAC became a controversial point. Some speculated that someone might have forced Ron to consume alcohol, or even that the test result was part of a cover-up. Sheriff Radcliffe initially entertained the idea of foul play. He interviewed at least one suspect, likely the very man the family had suspected, David Longberry, and even administered a polygraph test. Longberry, if he was indeed the one interrogated, apparently passed the lie detector. with no concrete evidence of another vehicle or an assailant at the crash site, and the polygraph's result muddying the waters. Sheriff Radcliffe eventually ruled Ron's death an accident. The official explanation? Ron, possibly under the influence, lost control of his truck and crashed fatally. Many in Circleville were not convinced. Almost immediately, whispers of a cover-up began to circulate. Some of Ron's relatives and friends were vocal that he would not have been drunk and reckless, especially with his kids at home. And what about that fired gun? Something clearly had occurred in those moments before the crash. That was more than just losing control of the wheel. The letter writer seized upon these doubts. Within weeks after Ron's death, new letters started arriving in Circleville, accusing Sheriff Radcliffe of orchestrating, or at least covering up, a murder. These letters insisted that Ron Gillispie had been deliberately killed, that the sheriff knew who did it and was lying to protect them. The implication was that the suspect who had been questioned, the same one Radcliffe said passed a polygraph, was indeed guilty, and that Radcliffe was complicit by calling it an accident. Mary Gillispie was devastated by the loss of her husband. In the midst of her grief, she also had to contend with persistent harassment. The letters did not stop with Ron's death. In fact, some became even more menacing. Mary always denied that she had been unfaithful to Ron prior to these events. However, she did eventually acknowledge that after the letters started, and especially after Ron's passing, she developed a relationship with Gordon Massey. They had been dragged under the microscope together, and perhaps through that emotional turmoil, found comfort in each other. Mary maintains that this relationship began only after the anonymous letters accused them falsely, a poignant twist where a lie perhaps nudged reality along. To the letter writer, Mary's new relationship with Massey was like pouring gasoline on a fire. They had warned her to stay away from Massey. Now, with Ron tragically gone, Mary and Gordon were indeed seeing one another. If the writer's original goal was to break apart Mary's family or punish her for some perceived sin, Ron's death and Mary's continued defiance would have been infuriating. Rather than stopping after this tragic turn of events, the writer kept up the barrage of hate. Mary continued to receive letters, some more threatening than ever. One letter directly threatened Mary's children, a new low in this campaign of terror. It read, "It's your daughter's turn to pay for what you've done. I shall come out there and put a bullet in that little girl's head." The writer was now willing to invoke violence against an innocent child to punish Mary. It's hard to imagine the fear and anger such a missive would have evoked. Mary reported this threat to Sheriff Radcliffe, who took it seriously. But try as they might, the authorities could not figure out who was sending these letters. They had no return addresses, were postmarked from Columbus, and contained no fingerprints or obvious clues. Meanwhile, community suspicion swirled. Everyone had theories. Some thought the writer might be an old boyfriend of Mary's, or the jealous wife of a man who had an eye on Mary, or an enemy of Superintendent Massey seeking to ruin him. Each gossip and theory only added to the tension. Despite everything, Mary tried to maintain normalcy. She kept her job driving the school bus. Remarkably, the Westfall School District did not fire her. The letters were, after all, unproven accusations. The letter writer took note of this and began targeting Mary not only through the mail, but on her daily bus route as well. Chapter 4. The letters continue. After Ron's death, one might have hoped that the letter writer would stop, as if whatever twisted vendetta they had would be satiated. Instead, the letters continued with a vengeance. They reached beyond Mary and the immediate family. Other Circleville residents began whispering that they too had received strange accusatory letters. These messages weren't all about Mary and Massey anymore. The writer branched out, pointing fingers at various community members for all sorts of alleged misconduct. A local politician was accused of embezzlement in one letter. Another letter claimed a school official was involved in some sexual impropriety. It was as if the writer had appointed themselves the moral judge of Circleville, taking aim at anyone they thought deserved humiliation. Yet, Mary remained the primary target. The initial allegation, her affair with Gordon Massey, was now effectively confirmed in the eyes of the writer, since Mary and Gordon did begin seeing each other publicly after Ron's passing. This sent the writer into a fury. They seemed determined to make Mary's life unbearable, perhaps to drive her out of town, or worse. One especially cruel tactic began in the early 1980s. The writer started posting signs along Mary's bus route. Crude, handmade signs appeared on fence posts and telephone poles near the road with messages maligning Mary and even her children. These signs were designed to publicly humiliate and taunt. Imagine driving a school bus full of children and seeing day after day nasty posters about yourself or your 13-year-old daughter. It was psychological warfare in broad daylight. Mary often stopped to tear these signs down as soon as she spotted them. It became a routine. Start the bus route, spy a sign with her name or her family mentioned, pull over after dropping kids off or before picking them up if possible, rip the sign down, destroy it, and hope the kids didn't see. The writer clearly watched for this because the signs kept reappearing, like a hydra, sprouting new heads each time Mary removed one. Throughout this period, Sheriff Radcliffe and his deputies kept investigating, but they were chasing a ghost. The letters were all mailed from Central Ohio. The writer might have been making trips specifically to post offices around Columbus to mail them, adding an extra layer of anonymity. Handwriting experts were consulted. One said that the letters could have been written by the same person, but in a deliberately unnatural style that made it hard to match with known writing samples of suspects. Dozens, eventually hundreds of letters were piling up in evidence files, but the case was no closer to being solved. Mary's relationship with Gordon Massey added another layer of complexity. For a long time, she had denied any affair. Now she couldn't deny that they were involved. To many, it looked like the letter writer had been right all along, even if it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Some people in town might have lost sympathy for Mary. seeing her as actually engaging in the behavior initially alleged. It's a tragic irony. If Mary and Massey truly were innocent at first, the letters inadvertently pushed them together in the aftermath. Gordon Massey himself was under immense pressure. He was a respected educator whose name was being smeared. There were letters sent to members of the school board and local officials calling Massey a philanderer unfit for his job. The scandal made it difficult for him to function. Sometimes in this period, Gordon Massey resigned from his position and left Circleville to take a job elsewhere. The exact timing is a bit unclear, but by the early 1980s, he was no longer in the local schools. The letter writer might have considered this a victory. One of their main targets effectively removed from power. Yet even Massey's departure did not stop the harassment of Mary. By 1982, Mary Gillispie had endured roughly 5 years of being stalked, vilified, and threatened by this anonymous writer. It's hard to overemphasize the toll it must have taken on her. She was widowed, raising her children alone under a cloud of slander. Every day she went to work, not knowing what new taunt or danger she might encounter along her bus route. And worst of all, the person behind it all remained a phantom. Many nights Mary might have lain in bed, eyes open in the dark, wondering who hates me this much. Was it someone she passed at the grocery store? One of the parents whose kids rode her bus? A member of her own extended family? The not knowing was a poison in itself. The community too was wary. The Circleville letter writer was discussed in low tones at the diner and openly at the barber shop. People traded theories. Meanwhile, the letter writer, emboldened by not ever being caught, was about to take things from the psychological to something far more physical and potentially deadly. Chapter 5. The Booby Trap. On February 7th, 1983, a new chapter in the harassment campaign nearly turned deadly. It was a cold, cloudy winter day in Circleville, with a steel gray sky and a damp chill in the air. Mary Gillispie was out driving her afternoon bus route, heading out to pick up junior high students after school. The country roads were nearly silent, aside from the hum of the bus's engine. The only sounds were the wind rustling through barren branches and perhaps a distant crow calling from a fence post. As Mary stared along 5 Points Pike, a rural intersection she traversed daily, something unusual caught her eye up ahead. There, affixed to a fence along the road, was a sign. Mary's heart sank. She had seen this sort of thing before. Even from a distance, she could tell it bore a message about her. This one looked larger and more conspicuous than usual, with block letters scrawled on poster board. As the bus drew closer, she could read enough to know it was obscene and targeted her 13-year-old daughter directly. The sign accused the girl of some lewd act, a lie so vile that Mary's protective instinct kicked into overdrive. It's one thing to attack Mary herself, but now the writer was dragging her child into it publicly. Mary decided to remove the sign immediately. Since she was on her way to start pickups, the bus was empty of students, a fortunate circumstance. She stopped the bus on the side of the road. The winter wind cut through her coat as she stepped down and approached the sign. It was attached to a fence post with twine. The message was disgusting, but Mary's focus was on getting it down and thrown away before any kids or neighbors saw it. As she tugged at the sign, she noticed an odd detail. A piece of string ran from the back of the sign down to a cardboard box on the ground, just behind the fence post. This was not typical. In previous cases, the writer had simply nailed or taped signs up. Why was this one tethered to a box? Mary paused. The twine looked like a makeshift tripwire. Carefully, she removed the entire contraption, sign, string, and box, together avoiding pulling the string taut. She placed the box on the floor of the bus, intending to examine it in a safer setting. When Mary opened the box, she gasped. Inside was a small .25 caliber pistol, rigged with an apparatus of elastic bands and the twine to fire if someone had yanked the sign off without care. It was a booby trap. Had Mary pulled the sign off from the front, as one normally might, the taut string would have yanked the trigger of the gun, causing it to fire directly at whoever was standing in front of it, likely her, or possibly one of her children if they had been with her. Mary's hands trembled as she realized how close she had come to being shot. The trap had mercifully not gone off. The would-be assassin's setup was a bit clumsy, and fortunately, Mary had the presence of mind to notice the string. Still, it was a crude but very real attempt to harm, even kill her. Mary immediately called the police. Sheriff Radcliffe and an investigative team from the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation arrived at the scene to analyze this sinister device. They carefully noted how the sign was constructed to lure Mary and how the box had been positioned to conceal the gun. The firearm had been crudely manipulated. Notably, someone had tried to file off the gun's serial number to make it untraceable. However, forensic technicians at the crime lab were able to restore the scratched-off number using acid etching techniques. The serial number yielded the registered owner of the firearm. To Mary's astonishment, and that of the entire community, the gun was traced back to Paul Freshour, her own former brother-in-law, Ron's brother-in-law, who had been part of the family's inner circle of confidants when the letters first began. Paul Freshour, the man who had helped write those letters to the suspected writer years before, the man who had shown concern and support as Ron insisted the letters signaled foul play, the man who had remained vocal that Ron's death was no accident. His gun was found at the scene of an attempt on Mary's life. This revelation cast everything in a new light. Could Paul Freshour have been the Circleville letter writer all along? The possibility was both shocking and, in hindsight, not entirely implausible. He was close enough to know the intimate details the writer knew. He had been part of the effort to flush out the writer. He had a personal connection, and perhaps grudge. Paul's marriage to Ron's sister, Karen Sue, had fallen apart not long before. They had separated in late 1982. A cloud of suspicion formed around Paul almost immediately in law enforcement's mind. Sheriff Radcliffe brought Paul in for questioning on February 25, 1983. Paul readily admitted that the .25 caliber pistol found in the booby trap box was his. However, he claimed it had been stolen some time ago. He hadn't seen it in weeks, maybe months. Living apart from Karen by then, Paul said he had stored the gun in his garage and rarely checked in on it. He had no explanation for how it ended up in that box. He denied outright any involvement in the letters or in setting up a trap for Mary. The investigators, however, were honing in on him. They asked Paul to take a handwriting test. The test they administered was highly unorthodox. Radcliffe gave Paul some of the actual anonymous letters and told him to copy them as closely as possible. Same wording, same style, onto a piece of paper. Paul, perhaps naively thinking his cooperation would prove his innocence, complied. He laboriously mimicked the strange block lettering of the Circleville writer. At times, Radcliffe had him write the letters while speaking them aloud, an odd procedure possibly meant to catch him off guard. Paul maintained that he only did what was asked, and since he had nothing to hide, he wasn't afraid to comply. From an evidentiary standpoint, that test was problematic. Normally, a suspect would be asked to provide a handwriting sample by writing a dictated text, not by copying the very item in question. By copying, Paul inevitably reproduced some of the stylistic quirks of the letters, which to the eyes of those eager for a match made it look like he could have been the author. Later independent handwriting experts would criticize this method, noting that it essentially trained Paul's hand to look like the writer's, mudding any true comparison. Sheriff Radcliffe wasn't interested in those finer points. In his view, the strongest piece of evidence was concrete. Paul's gun was at the scene. The handwriting similarities were icing on the cake. After the handwriting exercise, Radcliffe took Paul back to his garage, where Paul pointed out where he normally kept the pistol. Perhaps Paul hoped it would show how accessible the weapon was to others who might have wanted to frame him. But by that juncture, Radcliffe had heard enough. He considered this combination of factors, the gun, the writer's apparent knowledge, and Paul's failing marriage to Ron's sister, as forming a solid circumstantial case. Paul Freshour was arrested and charged with the attempted murder of Mary Gillispie. The news of Paul's arrest stunned many in Circleville. Here was a man who, up to that point, had been seen as one of the victim's family, even something of a crusader, insisting that Ron's death should be looked at more closely. The idea that he might have been the mastermind behind the entire ordeal, writing letters to torment Mary and others, potentially causing Ron's accident, and now trying to kill Mary, was mind-boggling. Some people felt an immediate sense of relief. Others who knew Paul well struggled to accept it. Paul, released on bail pending trial, proclaimed his innocence to anyone who would listen. He insisted someone had stolen his gun and was setting him up. He pointed out that the description of a mysterious man seen near the booby trap that day, a bus driver reported seeing a large sandy-haired man by a yellow El Camino at the site earlier, did not match him at all. Paul was of average build with dark hair. This clue, strangely, had not been pursued by the sheriff's office at the time. but Paul's defense would later highlight it. Nevertheless, by October 1983, Paul Freshour was headed into a high-profile trial, accused of a bizarre and nefarious crime spree that had haunted Circleville for years. Many hoped that at last the full truth about the letters would come out in court. Chapter 6. Investigation and Arrest. With Paul Freshour in custody and charged, investigators worked to build a strong case against him. They executed search warrants on Paul's home, which he had once shared with Karen, his garage, and any personal property that might link to the letters or the booby trap. In the garage, they found some small pieces of paper, some chalk and marking materials, and other odds and ends. According to later accounts, among the items taken into evidence was a very crude handwritten sign, just like the one on the booby trap that had been in Paul's garage, possibly a practice or leftover piece. This was presented as further circumstantial evidence tying Paul to the trap. Additionally, law enforcement gathered up 39 of the anonymous letters that they believed were particularly relevant to Paul's case and submitted them into evidence. Although Paul was not charged with the crime of writing threatening letters, the prosecution intended to use the letters to show a pattern that he was likely the author and thus had the motive and mindset to attempt murder. Paul's upcoming trial became the talk of Pickaway County. It wasn't every day that a local family man and former prison guard, Paul had previously worked as a guard and even served as an extra in a prison movie filmed nearby, stood accused of being a diabolical letter-writing would-be killer. The prosecution team, led by the county prosecutor, assembled their narrative. Paul Freshour, upset by Mary's alleged affair and by domestic issues of his own, had masterminded these letters to exact revenge and create chaos. And when that didn't fully achieve his aims, he escalated to a physical attempt on Mary's life. Paul obtained a defense attorney and prepared to fight the charges. His defense was straightforward. I didn't do it. I've been framed by the real letter writer. But the defense faced an uphill battle, given the damning presence of his gun at the scene. One curious aspect of the case involved Paul's estranged wife, Karen Sue Freshour. By the time of the trial, Karen and Paul were firmly separated, if not already divorced. Karen bore significant animosity towards Paul over their breakup. Reportedly, it had not been amicable. She had custody disputes over their children and other grievances. When investigators had first interviewed Karen in 1983, she did something that raised eyebrows. She told them she believed Paul was the Circleville letter writer. In fact, Karen had even visited Mary shortly before Paul's arrest to share her suspicion that Paul was behind the letters all along. At trial, the prosecution would lean on this detail. Even his own wife thought him guilty. While that sounds persuasive on the surface, one must consider Karen's possible motives. If Paul were convicted, Karen's life might be easier. No custody fight, possibly revenge for whatever wrongs she perceived from their marriage, and maybe even a measure of protection for her brother Ron's legacy, if she believed Paul had a role in his death. But in the courtroom, such psychological angles were largely left aside. The prosecution stuck to tangible evidence. Chapter 7. The Trial of Paul Freshour. Paul Freshour's trial for the attempted murder of Mary Gillispie began on October 24, 1983, and extended into 1984 for sentencing. It took place in the Pickaway County Courthouse, drawing considerable local attention. Farmers, shopkeepers, and housewives alike might find themselves on the hard benches of the courtroom gallery, eager to see and hear the mystery of the Circleville letters dissected in a court of law. The prosecution laid out its case methodically. They noted how the harassment campaign against Mary had gone on for years, culminating in the booby trap, and that the common denominator in all of it seemed to be Paul. They posited a motive. Paul had recently separated from Ron's sister Karen in an ugly split. Perhaps he blamed Mary for Ron's death or the family's troubles, given Mary's affair had indirectly led to that tragedy. Maybe he was a man with a grudge against Mary for her sin and against Massey for being involved, and even against Sheriff Radcliffe for not vindicating Ron. In short, they painted Paul as a bitter, vengeful man who hid behind letters and then tried to kill to have his final revenge. A key witness was the handwriting expert from the state's crime lab. On the stand, he testified that in his expert opinion, the handwriting on the booby trap sign and on many of the letters matched samples of Paul Freshour's handwriting. Now, the only sample the jury had seen was that dubious copying exercise Paul did. The expert conceded under defense cross-examination that the test was unusual. However, he maintained that certain distinct characteristics, like the way certain letters were shaped or spaced, pointed to Paul. The defense brought in, or at least cited, independent handwriting analysts who argued that the methods were improper and that it could not be conclusively determined that Paul wrote the letters. Ultimately, handwriting analysis is a somewhat subjective field, and it likely came down to which narrative the jury believed. Mary Gillispie herself testified, facing the man who used to be part of her extended family. She told the court that she believed Paul was indeed the letter writer and the one who tried to kill her. She recounted how Karen Sue had come to her and expressed suspicion of Paul, which for Mary was a turning point in realizing the enemy might have been within their circle all along. Mary described the day of the booby trap, how she saw the obscene sign, how she removed the box, and how terrified she was when she discovered the gun inside. Her voice likely shook as she pointed across the courtroom, identifying Paul as the owner of that gun, and, in her mind, the only person who would have had reason to target her family. The prosecution also introduced evidence that Paul had not been at work on February 7th, 1983, the day the booby trap was found. Paul's boss from Anheuser-Busch in Columbus testified that Paul had taken the day off. While that alone proves little, combined with everything else the state presented, it further insinuated that Paul could have had the opportunity to drive to the site and set the trap that day. Paul's defense lawyers tried to dismantle the state's circumstantial case. They pointed out that no one saw Paul set up the booby trap, and that others had equal opportunity. They raised the mysterious yellow El Camino sighting. A fellow bus driver, not Mary, had reported that about 20 minutes before Mary found the trap, she drove down that road and saw a large sandy-haired man standing next to a yellow El Camino at that very spot. The man turned away as if trying not to be recognized. This description did not match Paul, who was not large and had dark hair. Moreover, the defense suggested another suspect, perhaps someone close to Karen, had a brother with a yellow El Camino. This tantalizing detail, however, was somewhat speculative without a witness tying it to a specific person known to the jury. The prosecution brushed it aside as an uncorroborated red herring. One thing Paul's defense chose, perhaps unwisely in hindsight, was not to have him take the stand in his own defense. There are many reasons lawyers might opt for this. Maybe Paul wasn't a particularly persuasive or sympathetic speaker. Maybe he had inconsistencies in his story they didn't want exposed under cross-examination. Or maybe they felt the state hadn't proven its case enough, and that putting him up would do more harm than good. Regardless, the jury never heard directly from Paul asserting, "I did not do this." They only heard others speak for and against him. The jury deliberated and ultimately found Paul Freshour guilty of attempted murder. In their eyes, the evidence, especially the gun and the letters, pointed to him. The verdict was delivered, and Paul looked stunned. Later, he would say he was in complete shock, unable to believe that the jury ignored what he saw as glaring holes in the case. But to many in Circleville, this felt like justice and a kind of relief. The terrorizer of their town was finally unmasked and punished. The judge sentenced Paul to the maximum, 7 to 25 years in prison. This meant he wouldn't even be considered for parole for at least 7 years. Everyone assumed that Paul's conviction would put an end to the letter-writing spree. As the sheriff reportedly remarked to a reporter, "I guess this will put a stop to those letters now." Yet, as the world has seen time and again, assumptions can be terribly wrong. The Circleville letter saga was about to take one more bewildering turn after its supposed perpetrator was safely behind bars. Chapter 8. Letters from Behind Bars. Paul Freshour entered the Ohio State prison system in 1984. One would think that would be the end of the Circleville letters, and for a brief time after his imprisonment, it did grow quiet in Circleville. No new hate mail was reported in the immediate aftermath of the trial. Perhaps the townspeople were collectively exhaling, enjoying the return of normalcy. Mary Gillispie would drive her bus without scanning every fence for a nasty surprise. Sheriff Radcliffe might have felt vindicated and ready to move on to ordinary policing. Then, as if on cue, letters started being mailed to people in central Ohio again. The first trickle of them elicited disbelief. How could it be? Paul was in prison 90 miles away in Lima, Ohio. He had limited contact with the outside world, certainly no access to travel around posting letters. The authorities at first dismissed the new letters as possible hoax, maybe copycats. But the letter's content, style, and very fact of continuing suggested that the same old letter writer or determined accomplice was still at large. The letters arrived broadly, not just in Circleville. Some went to people in neighboring towns who had some link to the case or to Freshour. They were postmarked Columbus as usual. One letter, incredibly, was addressed directly to Paul Freshour in prison. It read, in part, "Freshour, now when are you going to believe you aren't going to get out of there? I told you 2 years ago. When we set 'em up, they stay set up. Don't you listen at all?" Here was the letter writer taunting Paul that he'd been framed and that he would ensure Paul remained incarcerated. This was a mind-bending development. If Paul was indeed innocent, it meant the real writer was gloating at having engineered his downfall. If Paul was guilty, what on earth was going on? Was he writing letters to himself in a bizarre gambit to maintain a facade of innocence? That latter scenario seemed far-fetched, but it had to be considered. Sheriff Radcliffe was not amused by the return of the letters. He publicly speculated that Paul was somehow still responsible, perhaps bribing other inmates to mail things, or conning a visitor into smuggling letters out. Radcliffe pressured the prison authorities to put a stop to it. The Lima prison warden, concerned by these claims, placed Paul under intense monitoring. At one point, they put Paul in solitary confinement for weeks, denying him access to pen, paper, and visitors to see if the letters would stop. They did not stop. All of the letters mailed during Paul's incarceration were, like before, postmarked from the Columbus area. None came from Lima. For Paul to send letters from prison without detection, he would have needed an elaborate network and pre-planned them with postmark tactics. A pretty elaborate conspiracy for a man under constant watch. the prison conducted full-scale investigations on at least 2 occasions, trying to determine if Paul had any role in the mailings. They searched his cell, monitored his outgoing correspondence, which they found to be entirely mundane letters to family and attorneys, and interrogated other inmates. They came up empty. Eventually, the warden himself wrote to Paul's wife, Karen Sue, acknowledging that in his professional opinion, Paul could not be mailing those letters. Still, when Paul came up for parole after 7 years, the Ohio Parole Board denied him early release, explicitly because letters were still being received across central Ohio. To them, it didn't matter if he was or wasn't writing them. The fact that these malicious letters continued meant that the threat associated with his case was ongoing. It was a Kafkaesque situation. If Paul was innocent, he was being punished further for someone else's action. If he was guilty, then he had apparently managed to continue his crimes from behind bar, something the prison officials strongly refuted was possible. A few days after his first parole was denied in 1990, Paul opened his prison mail to find that a mocking letter we mentioned, telling him he'd never get out. It was like the writer wanted to rub salt in his wound at every turn. Throughout his decade in prison, Paul maintained a model prisoner record. He worked in the prison print shop, stayed out of trouble, and focused on trying to prove his innocence. He wrote dozens of letters, legitimate ones, to legal authorities and journalists, pleading for someone to look deeper into his case. He compiled a 164-page document detailing the sequence of events, inconsistencies, and evidence he believed exonerated him. In it, he pointed fingers, notably suggesting that his ex-wife Karen and perhaps her new boyfriend could be involved in the letter writing and booby trap. Enter Martin Yant, a private investigator and journalist who took interest in Paul's claims around 1993. Yant had a background in investigating wrongful convictions, and aspects of Paul's story struck him as dubious. For instance, Yant discovered in the sheriff's investigative file the report about the yellow El Camino and the large sandy-haired man at the booby trap location, a lead that had never been pursued. Yant tracked down the bus driver who gave that description and confirmed it. He then found that one of the people in Karen's circle of friends at the time matched that description and had access to a similar car. This reinforced Yant's suspicion that Paul might have been telling the truth about being set up. In May 1994, after serving 10 years, the midpoint of his sentence, Paul Freshour was granted parole. By then, the letters had mysteriously stopped. The last known ones showed up in 1993. Some note that the timing interestingly coincided with Sheriff Radcliffe's retirement, though whether that's meaningful or just coincidence is anyone's guess. Walking out of prison, Paul was 50 years old and a free man, but he had lost a decade of his life and bore the stigma of being the Circleville letter writer in many's eyes. Despite parole conditions urging him not to stir up trouble, Paul was determined to clear his name. He gave interviews to local media and even to the TV show Unsolved Mysteries, which had taken up interest in the case. In these, he calmly but firmly insisted on his innocence, pointing out how letters kept coming when he couldn't possibly be sending them, and how clues like the El Camino sighting were ignored. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Circleville letters had transcended local lore and become something of a regional legend. People would bring up the case in the same breath as other famous unsolved mysteries. After all, an anonymous letter writer operating over decades is not a common crime story. Perhaps the most telling voice in support of Paul's innocence came from an unlikely source, Warden Arthur Tate of Lima, the prison where Paul was held. Warden Tate was quite vocal that he believed Paul did not write the letters that continued during his incarceration. "It's just not possible," Tate said in one interview. He mentioned how on one occasion, when letters were still being received, Paul had been in solitary with absolutely no way to communicate out. Yet the letters bore Columbus postmarks dated during that time. Unless Paul had an accomplice on the outside, it didn't add up. So if not Paul, who? This remained the burning question. And as 1994 rolled on, the stage was set for a larger audience to grapple with that very mystery. Chapter 9: National Exposure and Ongoing Mystery. By the early 1990s, the Circleville Letters mystery had gained national attention. In November 1994, the TV program Unsolved Mysteries aired a segment on the case, beaming this small-town saga into millions of homes across America. The show dramatized key moments: Mary pulling over to examine the booby trap, Ron's truck careening into the tree. With eerie music and Robert Stack's ominous narration, they interviewed Mary, who declined to appear on camera so her statements were read by an actor. Paul, freshly out on parole and eager to tell his side, and journalist Martin Yant, among others. Sheriff Radcliffe and Mary Gillispie both declined to participate, which left the TV program somewhat sympathetic to Paul's point of view, focusing on the lingering questions of the case. During the filming of the Unsolved Mysteries episode, the production received an anonymous postcard, apparently from the Circleville writer. Written in the same wobbly capital letters, it warned in no uncertain terms: forget Circleville, Ohio. Do nothing to hurt Sheriff Radcliffe. If you come to Ohio, you El Sickos will pay. It was signed the Circleville writer. The postcard was postmarked from Columbus, just like old times. This rattled the TV crew, but it also served as an electrifying hook for the story. It suggested that the writer was still out there, watching, and did not appreciate outsiders digging into the story. The use of the phrase El Sickos was bizarre and taunting, consistent with the writer's flair for insults. When the episode aired, It prompted a flood of tips and theories from viewers across the country, but none that cracked the case. It did, however, put public pressure on authorities. The Pickaway County Sheriff's Office maintained its stance that the case was closed, solved by Paul's conviction, and that any continued letters were either from Paul via surreptitious means or from copycats. The official line was, the Circleville writer was caught, but the court of public opinion was not so sure. One person deeply affected by the unsolved mystery spotlight was Karen Sue Freshour. According to some reports, not long after the episode, she remarried and moved away quietly, largely avoiding further comment on the case. If she did have any involvement or knowledge, she never came forward to share it. To this day, Karen has maintained a low profile. Her silence had sometimes been interpreted in wildly different ways. Either she was an innocent bystander who got unfairly dragged in and just wants to forget, or she was secretly culpable and thus staying out of the limelight to avoid scrutiny. There's no evidence either way, only speculation. The Unsolved Mysteries coverage also renewed interest from other media. In 1993, journalist Robin Yoakum, who had covered Paul's trial a decade earlier, revisited the story in a piece for the Columbus Dispatch. By then, Yoakum noted the letters had ceased following Paul's release in 1994. He famously quoted Paul's darkly prophetic lines, "When I'm dead and in my grave, people are going to believe I'm sending those letters." Yoakum's concluding sentiment echoed what many felt. We might never truly know the answers. In the ensuing years, the Circleville Letters case became a staple in true crime anthologies in Ohio folklore. Amateur sleuths continued to debate it on internet forums as those emerged in the 2000s. Paul Freshour himself created a website in the late 90s, laying out his side of the story in exhaustive detail, effectively a self-published manifesto of innocence and accusation against others. One of the enduring questions that these discussions grappled with was, if not Paul, then who? Martin Yant had come to believe that there might actually have been multiple letter writers. From his investigation, he identified at least 3 individuals who could have contributed. 1. A son of Gordon Massey, who might have harbored resentment towards Mary for his parents' marital troubles, and could have started the initial letters. 2. David Longberry, the jilted co-worker who likely began the campaign by targeting Mary and Massey out of jealousy. And 3. Karen Freshour, and possibly her boyfriend, who Yant suspected might have picked up the mantle later on, writing letters and even setting up the booby trap to frame Paul during the tumult of their divorce. Yant also pointed out that the description of the man by the yellow El Camino matched someone connected to Karen. These were explosive claims, but Yant never publicly named any of these other possible culprits, at least not without hedging. For its part, law enforcement never charged anyone else. To them, Paul's conviction was the period at the end of the sentence. Sheriff Radcliffe remained adamant that Paul was guilty until Radcliffe's own death in 2020. No new forensic evidence ever surfaced to definitively pin the letters on someone else. And so, in an official sense, the Circleville letters case remained closed, albeit with an asterisk in many people's minds. Chapter 10: Suspects, Theories, and Lingering Questions. The Circleville letter writer mystery has spawned numerous theories and suspects over the years, each with ardent supporters and glaring flaws. Let's carefully consider the main possibilities that have been debated. Paul Freshour, the convicted suspect. The simplest theory is that the authorities got it right. Paul Freshour was the one and only Circleville letter writer, and the perpetrator of the booby trap. Supporters of this theory point to the solid evidence connecting Paul to the crime, chiefly his gun at the scene of the trap. During Paul's trial, 39 of the letters were admitted into evidence. A handwriting expert testified that in his opinion, Paul's hand pinned them. Decades later, in 2021, the CBS show 48 Hours commissioned a fresh analysis by forensic document expert Beverly East, who concluded with 100% certainty that one person wrote all the letters, and that person was Paul Freshour. East highlighted unique quirks. For instance, the letter G was written like a number 6 in both the anonymous letters and Paul's known writing, and similar mistakes appeared in how zip codes were written. Furthermore, it was noted that Paul had not been at work on the day the booby trap was found, suggesting opportunity. If one looks at Paul's possible motives, some emerged. By 1983, he was an angry man. His marriage had disintegrated, and he might have blamed Mary's supposed affair for setting off the chain of events that led to his brother-in-law's death and his family's strife. Perhaps he had a righteous or jealous anger that fueled him to punish Mary and others via the letters, and eventually attempt to physically harm her. Advocates of this theory also speculate that Paul might have had help in mailing letters while he was incarcerated. Maybe he pre-wrote dozens and enlisted someone to send them periodically, or had an accomplice. That would explain how letters kept arriving despite his imprisonment. The flaws of this is if Paul truly was the letter writer, certain things are hard to reconcile. For one, the letters continued even when he was in solitary confinement, with no access to send them, requiring a level of planning or teamwork that seems inconsistent with the lone wolf portrait of him. Additionally, many who knew Paul swore he wasn't the type of man to orchestrate such cruelty. He had no known history of vindictive behavior or mental instability. The description of the suspected man at the trap site did not match Paul at all. And if Paul's motive was partly to punish Mary for Ron's death, it seems counterintuitive that he would start letters before Ron's death. In short, while the physical evidence against Paul was strong, there are significant lingering doubts about whether he truly acted alone or at all. Karen Freshour, the vengeful ex-wife. Another theory posits that Paul's then-wife, Karen Sue Freshour, was actually behind the letters, or at least some of them, and possibly the attempt on Mary's life. Karen had a potential web of motives. She was Ron Gillespie's sister and might have been resentful of Mary if she believed Mary's real or rumored affair led to her brother's death. Additionally, by the early 1980s, Karen's marriage with Paul was collapsing in bitterness. If Karen harbored ill will towards Paul, she might have seen the letter campaign as a way to ruin both Mary for revenge on behalf of her brother and Paul by framing him. Notably, it was Karen who first floated to authorities that Paul might be the letter writer, and Mary testified that Karen came to her unprompted, voicing suspicions of Paul, an action one might interpret as planting a seed of blame. It is speculated that Karen had a close male friend or boyfriend who assisted her recall the yellow El Camino and the large sandy-haired man seen by the trap. A man fitting that description was allegedly connected to Karen, and one of her relatives owned such a car. If Karen orchestrated the booby trap, using Paul's gun, which she had access to when they lived together, and having her associate plant it would brilliantly cast suspicion on Paul. When Paul went to prison, Karen gained full custody of their children and no longer had him in her life, an outcome she may have desired. The letters continuing during Paul's imprisonment could easily have been Karen's doing as well, to ensure he stayed locked up. Indeed, he was denied parole due to them. This theory, while intriguing, is circumstantial. Karen has never confessed or been caught in any direct evidence of wrongdoing. To accept this theory, one has to believe that Karen would be willing to terrorize her own brother's family just to get at Mary and later frame Paul. That level of cold-bloodedness is possible but hard to fathom. Also, if Karen was the writer, what was her impetus to start in 1977 before any clear personal motives existed? Unless she simply hated Mary or had some hidden jealousy, some wild speculations suggest maybe Karen had an affair with Massey or with someone else and projected it onto Mary. But there is zero evidence of that. Karen's defenders point out she lost a brother in this saga too, so painting her as the mastermind feels like victim blaming. To date, no concrete proof ties Karen to the letters or trap, making it a theory built largely on suspicious coincidences and second-hand hints. David Longberry, the jilted co-worker. A compelling early suspect was David Longberry, and many, including Martin Yant, believe he indeed penned the initial wave of letters in 1976 to 1977. Longberry had motive. He was infatuated with Mary and humiliated by her rejection. The first letters laser-focused on Mary and Massey's alleged affair, something David might have invented out of spite or misinterpreted from seeing them together at work. Longberry also had the opportunity, working in the same school system and possibly overhearing gossip or seeing Mary's daily routine. Mary and Ron actually suspected him first, which is why they wrote him those confrontation letters. And tellingly, the letters did stop for a while after they did so, suggesting the target of their warning got scared. After Ron's death, Longberry fell off the radar. Sheriff Radcliffe said a suspect passed a polygraph and was eliminated, likely Longberry. It fits that if Longberry was the original writer, he might have halted after that tragedy, not intending things to go so far. Years later, Longberry's name resurfaced when it became known he fled Ohio in 1999 after being accused of raping a minor. He died a fugitive some years later. This shows Longberry was, at the very least, troubled and capable of bad behavior. If he was the letter writer, it would mean Paul might truly have been an innocent man, caught in the crossfire of someone else's scheme. Longberry, as the sole writer, doesn't account for the letters in events post-1977. He likely did have a vendetta against others in Circleville who got letters in the 80s, and by 1983, Longberry was long out of the picture. Some say he left town even earlier, or at least was not an active participant in Mary's life. It's possible the initial letter campaign was Longberry's doing, and then someone else picked it up later. But if we isolate Longberry, he wouldn't explain the booby trap or continued letters at all. Thus Longberry fits neatly as part of the story, but not the entirety of it. Multiple writers, a conspiracy of rage. Increasingly, some investigators and followers suspect that more than one person was responsible at different times. Under this theory, the Circleville letters were not the work of a single mad genius, but rather a chain of events where one person's actions inspired another's, either through collusion or coincidence. For instance, maybe David Longberry started the letters in 1976 to lash out at Mary. After the scare with Ron's death, he stopped. Then, a couple years later, someone else with a different grudge, perhaps related to Mary's family drama, or an enemy of Massey, resumed sending letters around 1982. Possibly, this is where Karen, or someone close to her, comes in. That person escalates to the booby trap in 1983, using Paul's gun to frame him. Then, unbelievably, even after Paul is in prison, a third actor might keep sending letters, perhaps a prankster or someone who admired the chaos the letters caused, or even one of the previous culprits ensuring Paul stayed put. This theory tries to account for the contradictory elements in the case by saying, in effect, they're all true. Longberry did some, Karen did some, Paul might even have done some, or other unknown did some. It highlights that the tone of the letters shifted over time. Some early letters were more moral outrage, calling Mary a pig, etc., whereas later ones were more about punishing officials and keeping Paul in prison. Perhaps different authors had different agendas. Also, multiple writers could explain how letters still came while one suspect, like Paul, was incapacitated. The multiple writer theory can become a bit of a catch-all that's hard to either prove or refute. It essentially says, maybe everyone we suspect had a hand in it. But conspiracies with multiple people are prone to exposure, and none of these individuals ever confessed or clearly turned on each other. For this theory to hold, a lot of assumptions about secret alliances or coincidences must be true. It also undercuts what criminal profilers usually see. Such anonymous letter cases and attempted killings are typically the work of a single individual with a personal vendetta or psychological issue, rather than a baton passed among culprits. Nevertheless, the multiple writers' idea remains attractive to explain away each piece of evidence that implicates one suspect by attributing it to another suspect. It keeps the mystery alive by saying essentially there was more than one villain. It might be the only way to reconcile all the bizarre aspects, or it might be overcomplicating an already convoluted story. An unknown individual, the outsider theory. There's always a chance that none of the main suspects we focused on was the actual author. Some other relative, neighbor, or disgruntled person with a grudge could have been behind it. Over the years, names have occasionally been floated in whispers or on message boards, such as another Gillispie family member, a co-worker who disliked the school administration, or even a former student with a vendetta. One rumor that cropped up was that perhaps the letter writer was Mary's own son or daughter, years later trying to dissuade Mary from seeing Massey. But this is purely speculative. In truth, despite many suspicioned individuals, no hard proof ever surfaced against an alternate outsider suspect. It's also been suggested in hushed tones. Could Mary herself have concocted some of the letters for attention, or to throw suspicion elsewhere? This fringe theory posits that maybe Mary wanted to remove Massey's wife by creating a scandal, or even get out of her marriage. But it falls apart on examination. Mary endured far more than she stood to gain, and it's hard to imagine she would put her own children through trauma or kill her husband just to realize an affair. That idea is almost universally discounted. The outsider theories suffer from the fact that all known evidence, like the booby trap gun, links back to the circle of people we've already discussed. If, say, a random neighbor was the culprit, how did they get Paul's gun? How did they know intimate family details? It always tends to loop back to someone close to Mary or Paul. Without a confession or new forensic evidence like DNA from a stamp matching an unrelated person, the unknown perpetrator theory is hard to advance beyond general what-ifs. Gordon Massey's wife, Clara, was never officially implicated as the Circleville letter writer. In fact, her name rarely appears in contemporary reports. She was generally referred only as Massey's wife and not publicly accused by authorities. The letter campaign's accusation of Gordon's alleged affair naturally placed Clara in an uncomfortable spotlight, but there is no evidence that law enforcement ever treated her as a suspect. On the contrary, Clara herself was a peripheral victim of the harassment. She even offered a reward for information leading to the letter writer's arrest, demonstrating her cooperation in finding the culprit rather than shielding them. Clara Massey's involvement in the saga appears limited to the personal toll it took on her family. Public records show that around the time the letters began, Clara filed for divorce from Gordon, citing gross neglect of duty and extreme cruelty, though the couple eventually reconciled. This private turmoil has led some to theorize that Clara might have been a woman scorned, with motive to anonymously expose her husband's infidelity. However, no direct evidence supports the notion that Clara authored any of the Circleville letters, and no officials ever named her as such. In later interviews, even investigators expressed curiosity about whether Clara had received any letters herself, but none were found in the police case file. Gordon and Clara Massey had one child, a son named William Massey, who was a teenager during the late 1970s. Like Clara, William was not named by officials as a suspect in the Circleville letter case. His name does surface in later discussions and theories, but mostly as part of speculative narratives rather than confirmed investigation. Early on, a few of the anonymous letters were written in a different style and initialed with the letter W. Mary Gillispie, the primary target of the letter, reportedly found this suspicious and may have initially suspected it was William and sent the letters to William. In other words, Mary, her husband Ron, and their family briefly wondered if the school superintendent's son could be behind the warnings. However, this line of suspicion was never corroborated or officially pursued. Later analyses have cast doubt on the idea that William was the Circleville letter writer. At the time the letters began, William was only about 18 or 19 years old and still living at home. For him to be the mastermind, he would have needed intimate knowledge of many local adults' secret, far beyond his own family, and he would have been undermining his own father's career by urging the school board to fire Gordon Massey. Researchers point out the sizable logic flaw in alleging that an adolescent would anonymously terrorize an entire town, including mailing dozens of letters from a city 30 miles away, all while under his parents' roof. Indeed, one podcast host noted it would have been far-fetched for the Gillespies to send anonymous gotcha letters to an 18-year-old without simply bringing their concerns to his parents directly. In the decades since, William's name has appeared in a few multi-suspect theories about the Circleville letters, but only as one possible contributor. For example, journalist Martin Yant and others have hypothesized that there may have been at least 3 letter writers working at different times, one being the superintendent's son, another being a co-worker infatuated with Mary, David Longberry, and a third being Paul Freshour's estranged wife, Karen. This theory posits William Massey as the likely author of some early letters, perhaps the first wave focusing on his father's affair. It's important to stress, however, that these claims remain unconfirmed. William Massey was never charged or formally investigated in the case, and his alleged involvement is drawn from anecdotal evidence and hindsight speculation. No law enforcement agency publicly named him as a suspect, in the 1970s or 1980s. After all the investigations and theories, one critical question remains: why? What drove the letter writer or writers to torment this community for so long? If it was a personal vendetta, say jealousy or hatred, why expand it to so many others with unrelated accusations? Some letters seemed almost civic-minded, blowing the whistle on officials' misdeed, even if those misdeeds were unverified. It's as if the writer had a mix of motives, some deeply personal, the focus on Mary and Massey, others more generalized, exposing bad people in Circleville. Perhaps it started personal and became a warped game or obsession. There's even a psychological term for anonymous letter harassers. Poison pen writers often have feelings of powerlessness in life and get a sense of control and power by manipulating others through fear and secrets. That certainly could explain whoever was behind the Circleville letters. While the identity of the Circleville writer remains officially unconfirmed, the physical threat did stop after 1994, and no new letters have been reported in decades. It's possible the writer, if still alive, simply decided their mission was complete, or they were frightened after national TV attention, or, as some think, the writer themselves died or became incapacitated. The mystery simply went dormant, leaving behind a legacy of unanswered questions. Chapter 11: Life in Circleville After the Letters. Once the letters stopped and the years passed, Circleville gradually returned to the quiet normalcy it had always cherished. The 1990s and 2000s saw the town move on. Population growing a bit, new stores opening, old rumors settling into folklore. The letter writer became something of a boogeyman figure locally. Parents might hush children with mentions of not doing wrong, or the letter writer might get you. Mary Gillispie continued to live in the area. She eventually retired from the school district after a long career. Understandably, she has kept a low profile since appearing in the Unsolved Mysteries episode. By all accounts, Mary did her best to rebuild a peaceful life. She never married Gordon Massey. Their relationship apparently did not last many years beyond the turmoil. Massey left town for good, and at some point, Mary and he parted ways. Mary's children grew up and have families of their own now, carrying with them the memory of that turbulent time. One can only imagine the mix of relief and unresolved hurt they feel. Relief that the harassment ceased, hurt that they never got clear vindication of who caused their father's death and upended their childhood. Paul Freshour, after his parole in 1994, lived quietly as well. He remarried eventually and became something of an advocate for his own innocence until his health declined. He wrote a lengthy blog or open letter online detailing his side and naming who he believed were the real culprits, largely pointing to his ex-wife and her alleged co-conspirators. Whether you believe Paul or not, one must acknowledge the tragedy of his life. If he was guilty, he spent 10 years in prison for it, and never admitted it, going to his grave with secrets. If he was innocent, he suffered a great injustice, lost years behind bars, and died with the stigma still attached. In 2012, at age 70, Paul Freshour passed away. His death prompted a few renewed news stories, but no new revelations. In an interview shortly before he died, Paul said he had made peace with his life, but still hoped the full truth would emerge for the sake of Circleville and his family. Sheriff Dwight Radcliffe remained in office all the way until 2011, one of America's longest-serving sheriffs, and he died in 2020 at age 87. Radcliffe never wavered publicly that Paul Freshour was guilty. He often pointed out that after Paul went to prison, Mary Gillispie never received another personal threat, only those generalized letters that could have been from copycats. To Radcliffe, that was proof enough. Many in law enforcement circles defend Radcliffe's handling of the case, noting that he solved the booby trap crime, and the letters were a sideline that ceased in time. Others critiqued that perhaps Radcliffe had blind spots, that he too quickly dismissed leads like the El Camino, or that he was too close to certain town folks to see clearly. Remember, the writer accused him of a cover-up in Ron's death, an accusation that rankled Radcliffe deeply. Regardless, Radcliffe's contribution to the community were ultimately honored. His long tenure oversaw generally low crime, and he is remembered by most locals as a dedicated public servant who got thrust into a bizarre situation no small-town sheriff would envy. Over the years, Circleville's weird saga became a case study for criminal justice students and a popular topic in true crime media. It raises discussions about the limits of forensic handwriting analysis, the psychology of anonymous harassment, and the danger of confirmation bias in investigations. Once Radcliffe believed it was Paul, evidence pointing elsewhere may have been undervalued. Former FBI profiler Mary Ellen O'Toole, who examined the case for CBS's 48 Hours, noted how unusual it was for harassment to continue after a suspect is imprisoned, concluding that logically, someone else had to be responsible for those later letters. She also opined that the letter writer likely had a personality disorder, deriving enjoyment from causing pain and manipulating people, while maintaining a facade of normalcy in daily life. Tantalizingly, O'Toole even suggested the writer could have been female, saying that some phrases in the letters, "I'm a boyfriend of a woman," used in one letter, struck her as possible misdirection. She, like many, leaned towards the possibility that the narrative of a lone male predator might be too simple in this case. And what about Circleville's residents? For those who lived through it, the memory is undoubtedly vivid. But a new generation has grown up there, with only ghost stories and secondhand tales. Life carries on. The Circleville Pumpkin Show continues to be the biggest event of the year, drawing crowds and generating wholesome headlines. If you visit Circleville today and ask about the letters, a few folks might regale you with what they recall, but many younger residents might not know the details. Time has a way of smoothing the sharp edges of the past. Circleville, like any town, has faced new challenges and changes in the years since, but none quite as haunting as that long period when a mysterious letter writer held everyone in a grip of fear and curiosity. It remains a cautionary tale about how an unseen aggressor can distort reality and sow distrust, and it remains a testament to the resilience of a community that in the end got through it and returned to its friendly small-town ways. Conclusion. In the end, the Circleville letter writer mystery remains an unsolved enigma. Officially, law enforcement closed the book on it years ago, but in truth, it reads like a story without a clear final chapter. It is a case that has long since passed into legend, leaving behind more questions than answers. The calm, tight-knit community of Circleville endured nearly 2 decades of torment from this invisible menace. Yet, it persevered and reclaimed its peace. The mystery has intrigued and confounded journalists, investigators, and amateur sleuths for over 40 years. It is a narrative filled with richly drawn characters, a hurried bus driver, a vengeful letter writer, a steadfast sheriff, and a community caught in between. Perhaps in listening to this tale, one can almost hear the rustle of paper as each anonymous letter is unfolded, or the distant hum of a school bus along a country lane. One might even feel the slow creep of dread as the letters multiply, in the jolt of shock at each unexpected twist. We journeyed chronologically from the first ominous envelope in 1977 to the final faded postmark in 1994, tracing the steps of each key figure in every major turning point. Whatever your own theory of the case, whether you're convinced Paul Freshour was the culprit, or you lean towards believing in another mastermind, one cannot deny the enduring fascination of this mystery. The story's end remains just out of reach. No one has ever been charged with actually writing the Circleville letters, and unless new evidence emerges, no one likely ever will. It's the kind of open-ended tale that continues to invite speculation and doubt. As we draw this chronicle to a close, we reflect on what the saga left behind. It left Mary Gillispie with years of trauma and an undeserved stain on her reputation. It left a family fractured by suspicion and tragedy. It left a convicted man loudly proclaiming his innocence to the grave, in a town forever associated with an eerie riddle. In the gentle hush that follows such a story, one is left with a sense of unresolved mystery, but also admiration for those who endured it. And thus, our tale of the Circleville letters comes to an end. Outside in Circleville tonight, the streets are dark and still. The homes lie quiet under the same sky that once hung over uneasy minds, waiting for the mail. those days of dread have passed. The Circleville of today is far removed from the events of those years, but the story endures in whispers and recollections, a puzzle that will likely never fully be solved. Whatever the truth may be, the people of Circleville endured and outlasted the shadow of the letter writer. The mystery has become another chapter in the town's history, unresolved, yet finally at rest.